Well, today I'm delighted to introduce one of Google.org's newest partners and one of the world's leading experts on opportunity and mobility, and also a personal hero of mine. My team knows I talk about him all the time as someone who I think is doing some of the most fantastic work globally around inclusion, future of work, inequity. So we are thrilled to actually say just today that Google.org is going to be providing a $250,000 grant to help support some of the work that he is doing around opportunity insights. We don't do this with all of our speakers, so just so you know. But a little background on Raj, on Dr. Chetty, for those who don't know. So he's a professor of economics at Harvard University, and he was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and is the winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, given to the best American economist under the age of 40. Raj's work asks, how can we give children from disadvantaged backgrounds the best chance of economic prosperity? And one thing I find very powerful about his work is that he and his team have also figured out how to inject the data and, more importantly, the meaning into the central narrative of this country. And so his work has been popularized and been written about and is part of conversations that probably all of you are having without realizing perhaps sometimes his work is undergirding it. So for example, he has found that the generation born in the 80s is the first in modern history to have less than even odds of out-earning their parents. I won't give away all of your good stuff, but a personal favorite of mine, as the wife of a public school teacher, that high-quality elementary teachers generate long-term gains for their students, including higher college attendance and larger earnings. And that in 99% of neighborhoods in the United States, Black boys earn less in adulthood than white boys who grow up in families with comparable income, 99%. So this kind of work is shaping not only our work in policy and academia, but the conversations around America and why it's so important. So we're really pleased that Google's own chief economist, Dr. Hal Varian, is going to join us and do a fireside chat. And so we're going to start with Dr. Chetty coming up and giving us some context. Then we'll open up to have a chat, and there'll be lots of times for questions from all of you. So thank you.
Warm introduction, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the generous support of Google.org. Looking forward to partnering with you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit today about what our research group is focused on broadly on restoring the American dream. And I'm going to talk about how in our own local communities and our local institutions, we can make a big difference on issues like inequality and economic opportunity. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which of course is a multifaceted, complicated concept that means different things to different people. But I want to distill it to a statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is a way that the American dream has been traditionally conceptualized. The idea that through hard work, any child in America should have the chance of going on to have a higher living standard than their parents, of going on to earn more than their parents. And so what we're starting out with in this first chart is just an assessment of whether that's true in the United States today and how the American dream has fared over time. So what we're doing here is calculating very simply the fraction of kids who go on to earn more than their parents did based on the year in which they're born. And so as you can see here, for kids born in the 1940s and 1950s, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up relative to your parents. 92% of kids born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. If you look at what has happened over time, you see a very stark fading of the American dream, such that, as Jacqueline mentioned, for kids born in the 1980s who are turning 30 today when we're measuring their earnings, it's essentially a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. Now, this broad trend, I think, is not just of economic interest. I think it's of fundamental social and political interest in the United States, because I think it underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the US are expressing, that the US is no longer a land of opportunity as it once was. So motivated by that trend, in our research group, Opportunity Insights, based at Harvard, we're essentially trying to tackle the big picture question of, how can we restore the American dream? What is driving that trend? And our approach has really three central elements. The first, which will be very familiar to all of you here, is that we try to harness large data sets, typically structured data coming from government data sources, census data, tax data, things like that, in order to study how to increase upward mobility. And I think this is really a special moment in social science where, much as you all are using data in your work to improve the products that people have access to, I think our knowledge of social science is going to be revolutionized by modern big data in the coming decades. Second, we focus greatly, as Jacqueline mentioned, on not just doing this research, but trying to translate that research to policy change by trying to inform public conversations, or, as I'll give you a couple of examples of, increasingly partnering with local government agencies, colleges, other institutions to really create change on the ground. The third point of kind of departure for what I'm going to show you is that rather than approaching the data at an aggregate or national level, we really try to hone in on specific geographic areas or specific subgroups to try to understand what the drivers of inequality and opportunity are. And so the starting point for what I'm going to talk about today is that there are very sharp local differences in rates of upward mobility that I think should shape how we think about the broader problem of the fading American dream. And so I'm going to start by showing you that data with this map here. So just to give you a bit of background before I describe what it shows, we construct this map using data following 20 million kids from birth to adulthood. That's using anonymized information from tax returns connected to census records, where we basically track these 20 million kids, essentially all kids born in America in the early 1980s, follow them to adulthood, and look at how they ended up doing in terms of their earnings, conditional on growing up in a low-income family. And so what we're doing in this map is taking that data and assigning kids to locations based on where they grew up. We divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas, and in each of those areas, we take the set of kids who grew up there in low-income families, that is families at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, earning about $25,000 a year. We follow those kids into adulthood and ask how much do the kids who grew up in each of these places earn on average in adulthood. So think of this as a way of measuring how upward mobility varies across areas in the United States. And so the map is colored such that blue areas, like in the center of the country, represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, and red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So start by just looking at the scale in the lower right. You can see that there's a dramatic range in kids' chances of moving up across the United States, depending upon where they grow up. In the darkest red colors, you see that kids who grow up in families earning about $25,000 a year, their own incomes on average are about $27,000 a year in adulthood, like in a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. In contrast, if you look at the center of the country or a place like Salt Lake City, for instance, some areas on the coasts, you see numbers like 45,000. Kids starting out in families earning $25,000 a year are on average ending up earning about $45,000 a year. So there's a very broad spectrum in terms of rates of upward mobility within the United States. That aggregate national picture that I started out with really is driven by a great heterogeneity across areas. Now, naturally, the question of interest to us as academics and to policymakers is to ask what is driving this variation across areas and what ultimately might we be able to do to increase upward mobility in places or for subgroups where we currently have less economic opportunity. One thing I'd like to point out on that is that you might, one of the first explanations that might come to your mind is maybe differences in upward mobility across places are driven by differences in the types of jobs that people have access to, or things like, developments in technology and so forth. As you can see from this map, though, that doesn't entirely appear to be the case, right? So if you take an example like Charlotte, some of you might know that Charlotte, North Carolina is one of the most rapidly growing cities in the United States. It's had one of the highest rates of job growth over the past 20 or 25 years. Yet, as you can see here, Charlotte is one of the places in America with the very lowest levels of upward mobility among big cities for the kids who grow up there. So how does that add up? How can you both have very high job and wage growth and have very low upward mobility? So what's happening in places like Charlotte or Atlanta or a number of other high growth cities is that they basically import talent. Lots of people move to Charlotte, move to Atlanta to get those high paying jobs, but they don't necessarily grow up there. And it's not always the case that high job growth benefits the local residents, something we see in many different contexts. This is one example of that. Now, in this big map, your eye naturally gravitates to the broad regional variation. Places like the Midwest look better for upward mobility than the Southeast, or places in the industrial Midwest like Cleveland and so forth. But what is striking, and what we've been focusing on more recently in work that we released a couple months ago, is that there's substantial variation, not just regionally across the country, but even within cities at very small geographies. So to illustrate that, I'm going to turn and flip over to this tool that we've developed called the Opportunity Atlas, which you can access. And sorry, if we can just, there we go. So you can access this freely by just going to opportunityatlas.org and type in any address, very much like a Google map, and zoom into any area. So I'm starting out with the map that I just showed you at a national level. And now I'm going to zoom in, given local interest here, to the Bay Area and show you the same data now at a census tract level in the Bay Area. Okay, so census tracts are there's 70,000 census tracts in the United States, and each of them have about 4,000 people. So to give you a sense of scale, a place like Palo Alto is itself divided into 17 different neighborhoods in what we're showing you here. So this is very fine-grained information. Same statistic that I started out with. Take low-income kids growing up in each place and essentially calculate their average incomes in adulthood. There's some statistical details in the background, but that's basically what we're doing here. And so the first thing I'd like you to see on this map is if you look at the Bay Area, you see the same spectrum of colors that I showed you at the national level, right? So you can go from a place that looks like Alabama or Charlotte in terms of rates of upward mobility to a place that looks like Iowa within a few miles within the Bay Area. Now, some of the broad patterns here, will strike you as intuitive. So you see, for instance, that the peninsula, much of San Francisco, has higher rates of upward mobility than parts of the East Bay, in particular Oakland, right? But let me now zoom in further to discuss this variation in a little bit more detail, in particular to the areas where we have large low-income populations in Oakland and surrounding areas, to show you how you can pick out more granular variation that I think illustrates some of what might be going on here. So if we look here in Oakland, you see that there's a very sharp, almost a dividing line between Oakland and San Leandro, right, where the colors almost shift discretely from red to blue. So part of that is driven by something Jacqueline alluded to, which is racial differences in economic opportunity. So what you can do with these data is not just look at the data in aggregate, but look at specific subgroups. So what I'm going to do here is click on Black to subset the data to Black Americans. And you can see that some of that divide is driven by race, but even conditional on race, there are sharp differences in Oakland relative to San Leandro. So one thing I should note, just as a side note, as you pointed out, even within a given area, there are really sharp differences in rates of upward mobility between blacks and whites, and in particular between black men and white men. If you look at black women versus white women, you see very similar outcomes. But in particular for men, race plays an extremely important role, okay? And so it's important to see that even when you focus on the black population, there's still this substantial variation across very nearby neighborhoods. Now, if I look specifically at black men, where you see some of the most striking patterns, as I was just saying, and I'm going to look at black men growing up in the very lowest income families, you see that there are certain places here, for instance, let me click this tract, which is a neighborhood called Fruitvale in Oakland. And you see some really striking, I think, disturbing statistics about the United States. So here you see that for black men growing up in low-income families in Fruitvale, their average income in adulthood is $5,600, right? And importantly here, one thing I should note is we're tracking these men no matter where they live in adulthood, right? So these are people who grew up in Fruitvale. They might not be living there now, might be somewhere completely different, but among the set of people who grew up there, you have an average income of just $5,600. So how is that possible? The way you get such a low average income is by having lots of people who are not working at all. And in particular, what you can do with these types of data is look not just at income, but look at a variety of outcomes. So if I click over here now to look at incarceration rates, you see a really striking statistic, which is that 43% of the black men who grew up in this particular neighborhood are incarcerated on a single day, on the date of the 2010 census. So if you think about lifetime odds of being incarcerated growing up in that neighborhood, it's going to look like 60, 70%, something like that, which is how you end up with an average earnings of $5,600, right? So the point here is that there's this incredibly, granular variation. At some level, you might react to that by saying, I'm shocked by the magnitudes that we see such, adverse outcomes. But maybe I had some sense that there were parts of Oakland that are really tough places, high poverty, high crime. So qualitatively, maybe I'm not so surprised by that picture. But what I think is perhaps much more surprising is you can go to places that are just a few miles south, like down here in San Leandro, where you have rates of incarceration that are dramatically lower, 5% or 1%, compared to what the 40% that we were seeing in Oakland, right? And so the point I'm trying to make here is that when we think about economic opportunity in America, really we should be thinking at a much more local scale. It's not even about the Bay Area versus other cities. It's actually within the Bay Area and within a few neighborhoods that are within a couple of miles of each other that you see extremely different outcomes for kids. And so understanding what's driving that variation, in our view, can potentially provide a path to figuring out how you increase opportunity more broadly. So let me now, with that example, come back here and walk you through some further analysis we've done to try to understand what's driving that very local variation and ultimately what we might be able to do from a policy perspective to change outcomes in the red-colored parts of the map. So the variation that I was showing you in Oakland occurs not just there, but in many other cities. And I'm going to focus on a different example here in Seattle, where we're doing a bunch of work, where this is showing you the same kind of map of upward mobility in Seattle. You see a similar pattern of a very broad spectrum of colors, going from red in the center of the city to much greener colors in places like Normandy Park, south of the city, all right? So, what is driving this variation across places? Why does upward mobility differ so much across areas? So I'm going to show you a couple of results on that. The first point I want to make is that most of the variation in upward mobility that we're seeing across these areas is caused by differences in childhood environment. So there are really two key words there. The first is the word caused. As many of you might know in social science, traditionally it's very difficult to distinguish correlation from causation. But my view is with the availability of these large data sets, as I'll show you, we can make great strides in distinguishing causation from correlation. I'll illustrate that in a second. We think we're actually able to show that this is about the causal effect of where you're growing up. Second, it's about childhood environment and not about labor markets or conditions in adulthood. So the way we establish those findings is by studying 7 million families that move across areas in these data that we're working with. Rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, I'm going to summarize what we find with a very simple example. Let's imagine a set of families that move from the central district, which, as we saw in the map that I just showed you of Seattle, kids who grow up there from birth, they have average earnings in adulthood of $26,000 a year. And take a set of families that move from the central district to Normandy Park, which was in a much bluer color on the map, higher rates of upward mobility for kids who grew up there from birth. So imagine now a set of families that move between these two places with kids of different ages, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. So what we do is take those kids who move when they're exactly 2, track them forward 30 years using the tax data, look at how much they're earning in adulthood, and we see that on average, these kids who move at exactly age 2 are earning $39,000 when they're adults in their mid-30s, all right? So that's for the kids who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat that analysis for kids who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on. They make the exact same move. What you can see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from the central district to Normandy Park, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship is completely flat and there's no impact at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are really three key takeaways. The first is that apparently where you grow up really matters. Places have a causal effect on kids' long-term outcomes. It's not just that different people live in different places. Apparently, if you move a given child to a place that's a few miles away, you can see very different life outcomes for that child. That, I think, is a very encouraging result for trying to tackle problems like poverty and inequality, which we've all been concerned about for decades. because it shows that the answer, doesn't necessarily lie in switching to a completely different economic structure like Scandinavian countries or something like that. Often the answer can be 5 miles down the street where you see completely different prospects. Second, you see that what really seems to matter here is childhood environment rather than conditions in adulthood. So things like jobs and labor markets, obviously they matter, but where you're growing up, childhood conditions seem really central. And third, you see that every extra year of exposure to a better childhood environment improves kids' outcomes. It's not just the very earliest years that matter, which is often emphasized, especially recently in policy circles, but also, if you move to a better place when you're 10 instead of you're 20, there's still a substantial gain to be had. So environment matters throughout childhood, not just in the very earliest years. So how can you use these types of data to actually create policy change to increase upward mobility? So given what I've just been showing you here, one thought that might come to your mind is, what if we help low-income families move to better neighborhoods that we see will potentially generate better outcomes for their kids? Now, that's not going to be a scalable solution. You can't move everyone, but it is actually something practical to think about on a small scale. So just to illustrate how we're translating some of this research to policy change, this map, we're now showing you the same map, but we're overlaying where families that receive housing vouchers in Seattle most commonly live. So we spend about $45 billion a year in the US on various affordable housing programs. And what we see here is that most of those vouchers that people get from the government are used to rent housing in pretty low opportunity areas. They're clustered in the red colored parts of the map. So in light of this evidence, we've been working with the Seattle Housing Authority and the Housing and Urban Development Agency in the US to develop a pilot program, which we're testing using a RCT, a randomized controlled trial, where we're helping families with housing vouchers move to high opportunity areas by providing them information, by recruiting landlords to make them more willing to rent their apartments to these tenants, and providing housing broker search services to help you find units in these high opportunity areas. And while I don't have results to show yet, the preliminary signs are this is working incredibly well at essentially no incremental cost to taxpayers. You can help families access much higher opportunity areas where their kids will do much better. So this is a concrete illustration of how you can take this type of research and data and translate it to change on the ground. Now, I want to take a couple more minutes to discuss a different direction. So, this is, I think, a solution that's relevant for some families, but as I was saying earlier, it's not scalable. You can do this maybe for a couple million families, but you can't move everyone. So the deeper question is, how can you improve upward mobility in the places that currently have low levels of upward mobility? And so that's what our research agenda is centrally focused on now and in the coming years. As a first step, one useful way to think about it is, what are the characteristics of areas where we see high levels of mobility? Are there certain common features of those places? And the answer is yes. They tend to have 4 systematic characteristics. They tend to have lower poverty rates, more stable family structures, so a larger share of 2-parent families. They tend to have higher levels of social capital. So think of the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. Places with a lot of social capital, for instance, Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church, those types of places tend to have high levels of mobility. And then finally, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and access to high quality higher education, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. So this gives you some sense of the types of areas I think we should be focusing on. It doesn't necessarily tell you, though, what exact interventions you should implement in order to increase economic opportunity. And so the direction that we're headed in is partnering with many cities across America. In this case, I'm giving you an example from Charlotte, where we're using this Opportunity Atlas data to ask what types of programs, what's going on in neighborhoods in your city where we're seeing much better outcomes. Can we then learn something about interventions that might work by testing new things or looking at historical data about interventions that have been attempted and looking at the outcomes that have emerged. Okay, so let me wrap up, since I want to make sure we have time to get to your questions, by just making one final point here, which is usually we think about issues of equality of opportunity from the perspective of principles of justice. Everyone should have a shot at the American dream, no matter what their background is. But improving opportunities for upward mobility, I think it's important to keep in mind, can also be important simply for increasing economic growth. And so to illustrate that, I want to show you one final piece of data, which focuses on a specific pathway to upward mobility that's very relevant here in Silicon Valley, which is innovation. And so to do that, we're going to study the lives of 750,000 patent holders in the US by linking the universe of patent records to the tax data that we used in the previous studies that I described. So I'll start out with this chart here, which shows you, in some sense, your probability of becoming an inventor. Using patents as a proxy, I recognize that has some limitations. But plotting your probability of having a patent in your mid-30s, by the time you're 35 or so, versus your parents' income. And you can see that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're about 10 times as likely to go on to become an inventor as if you happen to be born to parents below the median of the income distribution. Now, one potential explanation for why you see this big gap is that this is about differences in environment and resources and schools, the types of things I've been talking about here. A different explanation is that this is about differences in ability. Perhaps the kids born to parents at the top 1% of the income distribution, your parents had to be pretty talented in order to get there. There's genetic transmission of ability across generations. Maybe that's why you're more likely to become an inventor. One way to distinguish between those two explanations is to use data on test scores early in childhood as a way to get a rough sense of whether aptitude seems to matter here. And so this chart, same y-axis, we're plotting patent rates, but now versus your third grade math test scores, as opposed to your parents' income. And so you can see here that if you happen to be at the top of your third grade math class, you're much more likely to go on to have a patent than if you're below something like the 90th percentile. Now, more interesting for what I'm talking about here is if you then split that out, looking at kids from high-income families in the green, families in the top 20%, versus low and middle-income families in the gray, you see a striking pattern, which is that high-scoring children are much more likely to become inventors if they're from high-income families. If you're from a low-income family and you're at the top of your third grade math class, it doesn't do a whole lot in terms of your odds of becoming an inventor. So to put it differently, apparently in America, in order to become an inventor, you seem to need two things. You need to have high quantitative aptitude, as measured by your third grade math tests, and you need to be from a high-income family. And so you can see why, from that perspective, increasing equality of opportunity could potentially be of benefit to all of us. Bringing these talented kids through the pipeline wouldn't just benefit them, but would potentially benefit all of us by increasing the amount of innovation. And so let me end by just quantifying the magnitude of that. If women, minorities, and children from low-income kids were to invent as the same rate as high-income white men, the data that I've been showing you imply that the patent rate or the innovation rate in America would quadruple. So there's a tremendous amount of talent, in some sense, being left on the table. And I think figuring out a way to harness that talent would be of great benefit to those kids and, more broadly, help us restore the American dream. So let me stop there. Thanks very much.
We'll have a few questions from me, and then I'll turn to Dory and turn to the audience here in the room. So we've got a lot of engineers here at Google, and everybody wants to know, what technology did you use to build the Atlas, briefly, and what was the most difficult part of it? What would you like to see improved?
So we were most focused on the statistical analysis, right? So we're doing a bunch of work internally at government agencies, Census Bureau, tax data, just constructing these big tables that underlie what was visualized in those maps. We then worked with a firm called Dark Horse Analytics that does data visualization that created the actual interface building off of a Mapbox tool. And I think the limit of how much I'll be able to talk about how that data visualization happened is very low compared to what all of you will know about this. But I think what would we like to see improved? I mean, I think we've been encouraged by the fact that 500,000 people have visited that site and various policymakers are using it and so forth. My sense is using that data could be used in lots of other applications. So having it pulled into situations where people are searching for housing or other types of things, kind of day-to-day practice, would be really useful. The other thing I think that we've struggled with a bit is there's a tremendous amount of information there, lots of different variables, lots of different ways to cut the data, and so forth. So how do you balance presenting that information in a way that is comprehensive, yet is not overwhelming for the typical user? And this is where, of course, Google excels in clear presentation and things like that. I think thinking about ways to do that would be really valuable.
One thing we have announced a few months ago is this Google Public Patent Database, which actually joins together all the patent offices in the world. So you can look at the U.S., China, Japan, and Europe in a unified way, and do all sorts of nice cross-country comparisons on the innovation dimension. But as I looked at this, as a data person myself, how do you get kids' third-grade math scores from 40 years ago?
Yeah, so I didn't go into the details.
And what was mine, by the way?
So that specific data was for all kids who went to New York City public schools. So for a separate study, which is actually what Jacqueline was mentioning, showing the long-term impacts of teachers, the way we did that study was by linking data for 2.5 million kids who went to New York City public schools between 1989 and 2009 to the tax data. New York City happened to maintain on tapes, et cetera, information on kids' test scores going way back. Got that digitized, so the whole process to link everything, as you can imagine. But that shows you the potential of what you can do, I think, especially when you combine these different data sets.
I just read a paper a few days ago by Stephen Rose, who's at the Urban Institute, and it's a meta-study of looking at different measures of inequality. So, for example, Piketty and Saez, who I know you know well, found that between 1979 and 2002, median income growth declined by 8%. But then they came back and visited it this year. Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman showed a gain in real median income of 33% when you account for taxes, transfers, price index choices, and household size. And this is similar to many other findings, of course, the Congressional Budget Office and other groups have studied this, and so much depends on what exactly goes into this estimate of household income. So I think the figures you were showing us were all numbers without including transfers, right?
Just straight earnings.
What's your view on this? How should you account for the existing transfer programs? How should you account for changes in real income? Household decomposition is another biggie. I'd be very interested to hear what you had to say on that.
So my general view on questions like that, how issues of measurement, is it really depends upon what question you're seeking to answer, right? So there's no globally correct measure. It depends upon what question you're seeking to answer. So in this context, the fading American dream, we chose to measure earnings in our baseline analysis at a pre-tax earnings level rather than including taxes and transfers. The reason we did that is we felt the notion of the American dream at some level was the idea of being able to do better than your parents in terms of your own earnings, perhaps, rather than getting transfers from the government. Of course, you could define it in different ways, and then the appropriate statistic would differ. I think one thing that's clear, regardless of the 8% decline or 33% increase, is that there's been much, much larger gains at the top of the distribution than in the middle of the distribution, right? No doubt. Even 33%, pales in comparison relative to the gains that people in the top 1% or the top 5% of the distribution have experienced. And that, I think, is very important and connects to what I was showing you at the beginning on the fading American dream. The fundamental driver of why you only have 50% of kids doing better than their parents today, as opposed to 90% for kids born in the 40s and 50s, is that the way in which economic growth is now distributed is extremely different from the way economic growth was distributed in the past. So growth rates, as you know, are a little bit lower today than they were in the 1950s and 1960s. But we show in that paper that if you had the same growth rates that you had in the past, high growth rates like we had in the 50s and 60s, but divided that growth in the way that it's shared today across the income distribution, you would stem only 1/3 of the decline in the fraction of kids doing better than their parents. Most of the decline is due to the fact that median wages, however you measure it, have largely stagnated relative to growth at the top.
So there's this other side. Your colleague Chad Jones has written a very interesting paper about why we saw such increases in productivity during the 60s and 70s. And this was potentially, he doesn't establish this, but by simulation, it's potentially the fact that lots of barriers broke down for women and for African Americans, and they were able to enter the labor force, dramatically increasing productivity. But at the same time, they were pulled away from the jobs as teachers and librarians and other low-income service jobs. So what was an opportunity for one group of people turned out to be a problem in terms of the community they serve. So you have to balance these two interests to really understand what kinds of behaviors should be improved.
And I think that's very interesting, Hal. I mean, there might even be dynamic effects, right? So if you imagine, people have argued that in the past, the quality of the teaching workforce was greater because you had many high-skilled women who would choose to go into teaching, whereas now they don't. And that, as you noted, could have potentially contributed to greater productivity in the 50s and 60s. But when you now think about the current generation, and you think about the long-term impacts of teachers, it may actually have adverse effects on productivity now.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the interesting findings that you said when a company or when high-income people move into an area that displaces or potentially displaces people who are already there. On the other hand, there have been other studies from Moretti and so on that show that when you see high-tech, high-paying firms move into an area, 5 new jobs are created over the course of a decade. So there's a lot of, I suppose I shouldn't call it trickle down, but trickle across. When you bring economic resources in an area, it tends to impact most of the participants.
So I think that's absolutely right. This is something we're studying in more detail at the moment. Basically, what are the effects of a new company coming in, Amazon, of course, the new headquarters, things like that. What impacts would that have on the people who were already there? So the fundamental advance we're able to make with the types of data I've been showing you today is that we're able to look at things longitudinally. You're able to track a given person over time. Why is that important? You might see that when a company moves in, lots of new jobs are created, et cetera, the place starts to look much richer in terms of the average incomes of the people who are there and so forth. A lot of that could be driven by migration, right? Lots of new people come in, lower income people get displaced, the place looks much better, but have you actually improved the outcomes of the people who are actually there? We actually, I think, do not really know the answer to that. What I've been showing you here is that, at least for the kids growing up in those places, it's not a one-to-one thing that they capture those benefits. And that's because there's so much mobility in the US. Of course, lots of people are going to move to Silicon Valley to get the great jobs that are here. It doesn't necessarily mean that the kids growing up in San Jose are going to directly benefit. And I think we have to think hard about how you make that connection. I think companies like Google can potentially play a role in that, thinking beyond attracting the best talent. How do you cultivate the talent in the areas where the company is?
Yeah, and I think this mobility, which you referred to, that geographic mobility, has really slowed down significantly in the last few years. It's much harder, much more expensive, much rarer to see lower income people moving into high income areas because, of course, they can't afford them.
Too expensive.
Yeah. On the social responsibility, when Google was, of course, opening a lot of offices in areas around the U.S., what do you think, what would you recommend or suggest that we could do to help be a positive force in the local communities in those areas?
I think one thing we find, so let's go back to the inventors data for a minute. So one of the interesting patterns, which I didn't discuss, is if you ask, what is driving these sharp differences in innovation rates across low and high income families, a lot of it seems to be about exposure. So let me give you the following example. If we take 2 kids who currently live in Boston, let's say they're at MIT, and we take one of those kids grew up in Silicon Valley, one of those kids grew up, let's say, in Minneapolis, which has a lot of medical device manufacturers. We see that the kid who grew up in Minneapolis is much more likely to go on to have a patent in medical devices, and the kid who grew up in Silicon Valley is much more likely to go on to patent in computers. More generally, the chances that you become an inventor in the field in which you innovate are greatly influenced by the area in which you grow up and the environment in which you grow up. And that operates in very specific ways. So when women grow up in areas where there are a lot of female inventors in a given field, they're much more likely to go on to innovate in that field. But if there are more male inventors in that field, it has no impact at all. on women's innovation rates. And so all of that to me suggests that what matters is exposure. And so if you think about a company like Google going into a new area, of course there's going to be a lot of attraction of top talent from other places. But thinking about how you develop programs so that you connect with the kids in local schools, you might have mentoring programs or other things that provide that sort of exposure in a scalable way. I actually think, designed properly and tested carefully with these types of data could have quite a substantial impact.
Right. And we have done some programs like that. I was talking actually at my bank, and the teller said, "Oh my gosh, my kid's taking your computer course from Google. I never even knew there was one, but we've been doing it for several years."
Evaluating the impacts of those things, figuring out how to scale them would be quite interesting.
Yeah, that can have a really big impact, I think, from Saturday morning programs, after school programs, and so on. One thing that we've been looking a lot lately is future of work issues. And as you know, there's a lot of issues about changing demographics, the composition of work, what kind of job opportunities are going to be available. Has any of your work shed light on some of those issues, or is that something that's for the future?
So let me say two things on that. One that relates to our work and just a broader reaction. So one of the things we find in our work is what seems to predict longer-term success, especially in the current economy, is not just technical skills. I gave you an example with math test scores, for instance. But more broadly, if you look at so-called non-cognitive skills, so measures of social skills, how well do you get along with others, discipline, and so forth, those are actually more predictive in the general population of longer-term success than technical skills. And I think that's going to be especially relevant going forward as man is in some sense competing with the machine. It's in the more social, kind of nebulous dimension, interacting with people and so forth, where I think there are big returns to be had. And so figuring out how you provide those skills in addition to technical skills, or some work showing that it's really the combination of those two things that's critical for success in the long run. So I think thinking about how education is not typically structured with that in mind. Traditional systems of education are about teaching a certain set of technical knowledge. I think figuring out how we adapt to that is very important. My broader reaction is people, I think, are rightly concerned about the future of work, but I would note that, 100 years ago, people were also extremely concerned about the future of work and thought that, once we had cars and all these other machines, there'd be nothing to do. And I think humans are inventive people, and we will figure out other things to do as the economy evolves.
Yeah, another important point is that the economic dynamism we saw in the 60s and 70s from the entry of men and women into the labor force, baby boomers and women who were being able to take up opportunities outside the traditional jobs, that's all running in reverse now. The baby boomers are all retiring, and women's participation in the labor force has leveled out or even gone down a little bit. So what we're seeing is a society in most developed countries that's really aging very rapidly. And you'd expect to see maybe less dynamic behavior. You might see less support for education, for example, from that political change.
Possibly.
Because and there are big changes geographically between what's happening, let's say, in Utah and Nevada and what's happening in Wisconsin and Michigan. So quite interesting areas.
Thanks so much for sharing beautiful insights based on the data. You talked about red pockets in blue areas, like the Central District in Seattle or Oakland in California. What does the picture look like in the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, that are largely red? What's the notion of moving to a better neighborhood 5 miles down the road? What does it look like?
Good question. So I didn't, I could show you a map, or you could look yourself by going to this website at a place like Charlotte or Atlanta, and you would see very much the same picture actually that I showed you in Seattle, which is what I think is the encouraging thing. So when we've done this work kind of zooming in over time to narrower geographies as we've had better data. So we put out a study comparing basically cities at the metro area level about 4 years ago, and Charlotte was ranked 50th out of 50 in that list, and they got, they were both unhappy about that, but also motivated to try to do something about it. But at that point, all we could say is Salt Lake City looks much better than Charlotte, was like kind of interesting, but what do you do about that, right? What's more interesting, I think, now and what we've put out a couple months ago is that you see that even within Charlotte, there are lots of places that actually look like, the best places in Seattle or Iowa, et cetera, even within Charlotte itself. So it's not like entirely a sea of red. And I think that's extremely important because it shows people in Charlotte you can look within your community to figure out how you potentially expand those opportunities elsewhere.
What about the Dory question here on who becomes an inventor in America? This company's demographic disparity. What would you recommend to bridge this gap between the socioeconomic issues that impact innovation and what we're trying to do here?
I mean, I think it comes back, some of it can be done at the level of a company. I think some of it comes back to social issues that the government and the broader public has to tackle, right? So what I will say, looking at this question on disparities in demographics, one thing that comes to mind is if you don't do anything, these things are changing, but at an extremely slow rate. So we see, for instance, if you look at gender disparities in innovation, 14% of patents in the US currently go to women. And that's changing at a rate of 0.25 percentage point per year. It's increasing at a rate of 0.25 percentage point per year. So if you just do the math, that means it's going to take another 140 years to reach gender parity at the current rate of progress, right? So the question is, how do you accelerate that? At some level, I feel like it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, where if there were more women in innovation in companies like Google, I think more girls would be inspired to pursue those careers. So the question is how you get that cycle started. I think some of it comes back to some of the broader factors that I was talking about on other dimensions, thinking about racial disparities, socioeconomic disparities, schools, the segregation in our neighborhoods, the lack of contact between low and high income people, things like that.
It would be very interesting to see what happens to schools in New York where Amazon is moving in.
Yeah.
There'll be a proliferation of private schools, of course. There'll be a proliferation of charter schools and, of course, the New York educational schools, which are pretty good compared to the national average. Question here.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to speak with us. One thing that I thought was really compelling about your talk was the focus on from big data to hyper-local data and how we can begin exploring those kinds of interesting topics to figure out ways to change our economic mobility. At Google, I'm working strategy and analytics in the human capital side, so it's also interesting from there. But outside of work, I run a nonprofit called Consult Your Community that helps college students work with small business owners to kind of focus on this space. So my question for both of you is, what's the role in local nonprofits and community builders in helping accelerate this change from a different angle?
So I think local nonprofits, as you can see with these data, I think they can play a huge role given that the scale of the problem appears to be fairly local. What I think would be really useful to do, and what we're trying to do with our group Opportunity Insights with these data, is connect with lots of nonprofits like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, other groups like that that are doing things in mentoring or racial issues, criminal justice, et cetera, to try to evaluate more systematically what has the most significant impacts in the long run, right? I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between lots of people who are doing really good work on the ground, where they have a sense that this might be working, but how do we scale that? How do we think about, in a cost-effective way, which aspects of different programs are successful? I think these sorts of data can be useful in figuring that out. And there's a disconnect between those people on the ground and researchers who may not be as aware of the various programs that people are trying and so forth. So one of the things we're trying to do is bring those things together and hopefully have more to say about it in the coming years.
What about this question on the correlation causation issue? An alternative hypothesis might be parents who are really interested in the kids might move earlier.
Yep.
And by the way, as you know, there are studies of immigration where immigrants tend to be highly motivated people who make decisions and move. And is it really the immigration per se, or is it those characteristics of being highly motivated?
So this is a great question, gets at kind of the heart of the statistical issues in the paper. This is referring to the graph I showed where the earlier you move to Normandy Park in that example versus the Central District, you appear to have better outcomes in adulthood. So natural concern you might have, maybe the people who move when their kids are younger are more motivated, they're more educated, maybe they're different in various ways. That's why their kids earn more in adulthood, not because they're growing up in Normandy Park. That would be a natural confound we would worry about. Give you a sense of how we can deal with that kind of issue. So with the amount of data you have, you can compare siblings within the same family. So the way we would talk about that in a regression context is put in family fixed effects. So you're only comparing kids within the same family. And so effectively what you're doing there is asking, suppose I moved to Normandy Park with a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old. I now compare their outcomes. What is remarkable is you get exactly the same chart back if you only rely on within family comparisons. So in other words, your younger kid does better than your older kid exactly in proportion to the age gap between the two kids. So if you think about, could it be a confound, that eliminates a lot of possibilities that it's about different families who are moving when their kids are young versus old, et cetera. And so we do a bunch of other things along those lines, including actually study a pure randomized experiment called the Moving to Opportunity experiment, where housing vouchers were randomly assigned. And we show that you get this pattern. So I think we're quite convinced that this really seems to be a causal effect.
Excellent. Jackie?
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think the role is of government policy in creating some of these low opportunity neighborhoods. So for example, a lot of, I think, high concentrated poverty communities are housing projects where government policy requires you not to have two parents, and requires there to be, this high percentage of exactly the opposite of all the things you said are important, low social capital and all of that. So the role of government policy and or market policy, for example, redlining districts and not allowing people to move to opportunity.
Yeah, I think government policies inadvertently perhaps, and historically perhaps by design, have led to tremendous segregation that have basically made it hard for people to access opportunities. Let me give you 2 concrete examples of that we are thinking about. So as I was saying earlier, we spend $45 billion a year on affordable housing in the US. You would think the intention of that is to try to provide people access to housing that will give them better opportunities. In practice, I think unfortunately, much of that expenditure is working in the opposite direction. So I gave you one example with the housing vouchers where, for whatever reason, families are using these vouchers to live in pretty low opportunity areas, thereby basically exacerbating the problem of a lack of intergenerational mobility. A different example of that, which gets to government policy design, something called the low-income housing tax credit, where we spend about $6 billion a year giving developers tax credits to develop affordable housing. But the way that program is structured is we give you bigger incentives if you develop housing in high poverty, would end up being relatively low opportunity areas. So we're basically concentrating poverty further. If you overlay where these light tech developments are on our maps, they're all in very low opportunity places. And so I think that is, unless you think those developments are going to change the level of opportunity in that area, which is something one can look into, you might actually be exacerbating the problem through the design of that policy. Another example, which will be familiar for folks here in Silicon Valley, is zoning and the ability to build housing, right? So ultimately, you can move people around, but supply is a fundamental constraint. Like if you can't build any housing in Silicon Valley area, that's going to prevent people from being able to live in places where their kids would do very well. There are serious political economy problems there, where if you already own a house in Silicon Valley, you might not want to vote for more building and so forth. But I think figuring out how you get around the zoning restriction so you have more density of development, more mixed income communities is another area where one can have huge impact.
We talked about this first question here already before the meeting, but one of this and Susan Popkin's research suggests adverse effects for children due to the disruption that's caused by moving.
Yep.
So that's how do you view that in terms of this prescription?
Yeah, so the way I would think about the moving idea is not that we're going to uproot families that are happily living in a place and ask them to move somewhere else. The way this actually works, for instance, the Seattle experiment I was describing to you, is we take a set of families that have come into the housing authority, they're looking to move. 20% of low-income families move anyway every year. And I think about it as kind of redirecting the flows. You've decided to move, you're going to move somewhere. Let's give you the information and support to potentially move to a place where your kids will thrive, not let's go find somebody who doesn't want to move and encourage them to move. So that's the way I think about this issue, kind of in a narrow sense. But the broader question is, how can you revitalize communities, which of course is the big issue. And some of it, you might think about the factors that I was describing related to changing the quality of schools, trying to have better teachers. You think about things like social capital and family structure. Those things might be very important, but how do we change them? That's a really difficult question. So the best I can say there is we are trying to now use these data to study various community revitalization efforts that have been conducted over the past 20 years or so by the government, by local nonprofits, by developers. We're building a huge database of all such efforts around the United States, and then evaluate with this longitudinal data what are the characteristics of the things that seem to have worked and things that haven't. And that's our hope of getting a scientific answer to that question.
Excellent. Well, our time is up, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.